Should we all start thinking about reducing our plastic exposure?
Yes.
Okay. Are there microplastics in the air that we breathe?
Yes.
Can we remove plastics in our body naturally through our own detoxification systems?
Yes.
Can we actually reduce our exposure in the environment when we're outside?
Yes.
Could microplastics drive chronic inflammation?
Yes.
Is there plastic in my tap water?
Possibly.
Oh. And does my tea bag really shed plastic when I dunk it into hot water?
Possibly.
Oh, gosh. Okay. We've got a lot to unpack. I thought we could start by just determining what we mean by plastics. And I hear a lot of terms like plastics, microplastics, nanoplastics. Can you give us sort of like a broad overview of all those different terms for our audience?
Sure. So plastic is obviously plastic materials. We typically make them from petrochemicals, so from oil and gas. That's the source of carbon within the plastic. And it almost always contains chemicals as well. So plastic associated chemicals. And these give it certain properties like flexibility, flame retardants, antimicrobial properties. However, there are other forms of plastic. So I guess we've designed it to do certain jobs, never with the anticipation it would get in our bodies.
Right.
But now we know it does break down. So we have microplastics. You would expect a microplastic to be on the micron scale, but actually an arbitrary definition came about. It's anything below 5 millimeters in size.
5 millimeters?
Yeah.
So that's pretty big.
So you could even see microplastics.
Yeah.
This was from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the NOAA, which is an American institute. And I don't know where it came from, to be honest. Maybe practical. How do you separate them from sediments and water and things where they were first being found? Nanoplastic is anything on a nano scale, so measuring below 1 micron, and 1 micron is 1,000th of a millimeter.
Okay. And when we talk about the plastics that are potentially causing issues in our environment and our bodies, are we referring to a particular type of one of those plastics as in terms of size, or across the board are they causing these issues?
So I would say laboratory studies, experiments which focus on cells or mouse models, rats, things like that, they typically observe toxicological effects for very small microplastics and nanoplastics. But the particles that we measure in the environment typically larger. And it's just this misalignment, right? It's really difficult and challenging to analyze microplastic in samples. Some techniques that are used have restrictions on the sizes or limitations on the size that they could actually measure. And so there's a bit of a bias towards larger particles being detected and reported in the literature. Whereas the toxicology focuses on the smaller stuff that's really hard to measure. And so to draw a line between one or the other is quite hard. What does this toxicology data mean when we don't really know how much of these small particles we're exposed to?
And just for the sort of physics geeks out there listening to this, of which there will be many, myself included, what kind of laboratory equipment do we use to actually measure plastic in the environment?
Sure. So there are two types. So one is a physical chemistry technique called vibrational spectroscopy. There are two variants of this. One uses infrared energy. The other uses single wavelengths, typically nearer infrared energy. And these are called infrared spectroscopy and Raman spectroscopy. They're almost always coupled to a microscope to enable the analysis of microparticles. And so it's Raman microspectroscopy and micro infrared spectroscopy.
And I mean, your research focuses on micro and nano plastic exposure and how that contributes to disease and measuring it in human tissues. How do you measure plastics in the body?
So I focus on Raman microspectroscopy. Okay. It just has a smaller size resolution or spatial resolution, which means that we can characterize the composition of particles down to much smaller sizes than would be possible with the other technique.
Gotcha.
There is one more technique that I didn't mention. It's an analytical chemistry technique. So it's gas chromatography mass spectrometry, but the sample introduction at the start is done via pyrolysis. So you superheat your sample to like 600 degrees in an inert atmosphere. And that's needed to break down plastics because they're very resistant and thermally stable.
Oh, wow.
So you need these high temperatures to break apart plastics in your sample. And then they break into these smaller molecules, which we use as markers to indicate the presence of the original plastic.
Okay. Yeah. And the tissues of interest for you, what would those be? I mean, I'd be interested in testes, brain, ovaries. What sort of tissues are you looking into?
Different ones, actually.
Different ones.
So really, this is interesting. Okay. Yeah. So, well, initially we've focused on the gut, and we have interest in the lung, and that's really just at the very fundamental stage at these points of contact, because really those two barriers are where you will first contact microplastic, either ingested or inhaled microplastic. Do they gain access to these barriers or across these barriers? Because it's from there that they will then enter circulation or the lymphatics. They'll circulate around the body and then distribute to the secondary organs. But then on the secondary sort of tissue side of things, so where are these things ending up? I'm interested in points of accumulation, I guess. And that's for two reasons. So firstly, the levels that we measure in the environment are actually quite low compared to other particles. And so therefore where they end up in the body is probably where they're going to accumulate. And they're persistent, right? They're very persistent and resistant to degradation. So you will see this accumulation happen. And so I think there's probably going to be more of a chronicity to the effects, or like a longer term health outcome that we want to look at wherever these are accumulating in the body.
Yeah, that's a really important word, accumulation, that I want to come back to a little bit later. You mentioned plastic associated chemicals at the start here. So these are chemicals, like you said, that give different properties to plastic. This is a silly question. Are plastics one thing that have these chemicals added to it to give the different types of plastics that we see and we work with every day, like, you know, the bendy plastic in our water piping, the plastic that we use for athleisure wear, or in the kitchen, for example? Am I being silly in saying that?
No. Yeah. So, I mean, plastics is a massive umbrella term, right? So fundamentally, and this is a guess for the chemistry geeks, a plastic is a synthetic organic polymer. So the organic part being organic carbon being the sort of fundamental ingredient in it, synthetic being that we make it, we synthesize it ourselves, and polymer being that the overall chemical structure is a chain of units, single units. So they're these sort of organized as chains and then aligned chains, and like there's linkages between the chains, and this is kind of builds up and builds up and builds up to build a plastic material as we would know it, with the addition of chemical additives. So yeah, I mean, plastic describes a wide range of materials. I guess there are around 6 plastics that comprise most of the production volume. So the most common is polyethylene. You get low and high density varieties. Polypropylene is very common as well, or comprises a large production volume. Then it's polyvinyl chloride, then polystyrene. I think you have polyamide in there, polycarbonate as well. So I would say those are kind of the main plastic materials in our everyday world, if you like. But now, of course, this description or definition goes much wider, because we've got alternative materials coming in as substitutes, but they're still plastics. So whether you get the carbon from oil and gas or from plants, for example, you're still making a plastic material. You have some petrochemical based plastics which are biodegradable. and some plant-based plastics which aren't biodegradable.
Really?
So the definitions are getting very murky. There's lots of crossovers and I guess a lack of clarity, but they're all plastics.
I want to ask about plant-based plastics. Rubber, is that the same thing?
Yeah. So this synthetic organic polymer term includes thermoset plastics and thermoplastics, which are kind of like the common plastics you'd be used to, like polyethylene terephthalate, polystyrenes. But then there's an extra group called elastomers or rubbers.
Okay.
So they all come under this synthetic organic polymer heading, if you like. I would say it's more like a cousin rather than like a brother or sister. But often when we talk about microplastics, we include tire wear within that. So the breakdown of synthetic and natural rubber tires on cars, vehicles. So I would say it's closely related and often kind of just bunched under the heading. Obviously, rubber has quite different properties to plastics. Right? It's elastic, so absorbs energy differently, but also a slightly different composition, different set of ingredients, if you like, with respect to the additives, the chemical part.
Okay. Okay. So plant-based plastics, from my very naive, perhaps naturalistic fallacy biased mind, if I see a bag or some sort of plastic that has come from plant-based materials, I automatically assume that's better for the environment, it's easier to break down, etc., etc. Is that a completely the wrong approach?
Well, I would say it's better for the environment because the carbons come from a renewable source rather than the finite petrochemical source. But really, unless it says it is fully biodegradable or compostable, and that, by the way, could mean in-home compost or in industrial compost. So compostable doesn't always mean it will break down in the environment or it will break down in your home compost.
Right.
Sometimes it requires very specific conditions, temperature, oxygen, pH, which you get in industrial composting heaps in order to catalyze the breakdown. So not all plant-based material is biodegradable. Sorry, not all plant-based plastic is biodegradable, but the source of carbon is better.
Right. Okay. So if I go to a store and they've got plant-based plastic and it says biodegradable on it, just the word biodegradable, not whether it's industrial, compostable, or what should I?
Yeah, I mean that's what is biodegradable? The
So
definition is very
interpretation.
vague.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
I think normally that would probably mean under industrial composting conditions. Biodegradable could mean it will start to biodegrade, but under what time order?
Right.
So I think that the definition of biodegradable with respect to plastics, especially thinking of end of life and waste management, things like that, just needs strengthening a bit. And I think there needs to be better clarity for the consumer.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, this is conjuring up a whole bunch of suspicion in my mind about some of these.
But this is the thing, right? So I go to coffee shops. I like coffee and
love coffee.
I love coffee, exactly. And sometimes I'm guilty of forgetting my keep cup, but I need that coffee.
Yeah.
So I get a takeaway cup from the coffee shop, and it's like greenware, blah blah blah. Like, this is great. This is compostable, or it's like a green plastic. But when you see the recycling loop, it's not going to go into the normal recycling as we know it. It's only going to be compostable if it gets into industrial composting.
Okay.
And that's not a loop we have in the UK. There are no bins for that in London, right? In central London, for example. So it's all part of greenwashing, essentially. And it really frustrates me because I come away with this cup. The cafe think they've done a good thing. I look at it and I'm like, well, all I can do is put that in the general waste stream because it won't get recycled, it's not recyclable, and there's no industrial composting bin here for me to put it into.
So even though it could be composted, it's compostable in an industrial composting pit, we don't have the facility for that in this
No,
country,
not
and then
always,
so it's just
yeah.
going to go to landfill.
There are sites around the UK that do it, but that's typically for green waste, like your garden waste. So
Okay.
they'll take that waste, or food waste, you know, from like the home curbside collections.
Gotcha, yeah.
But there's not, for example, centralised industrial composting waste infrastructure. There's no bin for that
Right.
in public spaces in London or well, anywhere in the UK.
Gotcha. So you got to take it home.
Take it home, stick it in your food bin if you have one.
They're not always going to do. I mean, I don't have a
Yeah.
food bin. We don't have a food
No,
bin. in
we
our
don't
local
either.
area, which is really
Yeah.
frustrating because we do the separation, but it's kind of futile because basically it just goes into landfill,
Yeah.
which is really upsetting.
Yeah.
Gosh. Okay. Within this sort of world of, I mean, you just mentioned the coffee cup, and that made me think of the lining of the coffee cup. So, you know, I might be drinking from a cardboard coffee cup, but it's lined with plastic, right, to maintain the integrity of the cup,
Yes.
such that the hot contents don't start composting it.
Yeah.
What about those?
Yeah, well, it's the same. I mean, it's not going to compost, and it's, you know, probably quite problematic from a recycling perspective because it's a mixed material, and it would require separation, and there's not always that capacity, or you know, you're not always allowed to do that depending on where you are in the UK, for example. And there's also evidence to suggest that when you drink from those coffee cups, that there is a certain amount of particles that are shed or released from that lining.
Wow.
Because of the heat stress from the hot water. And either it's the heat kind of degrading it and shedding these particles, or the particles were there left over from the manufacturing process, and then they're released into the liquid when it's filled with it.
Wow.
There is another hypothesis that there are even smaller molecules of plastic, kind of the same recipe, if you like, or ingredients, but smaller than what we would say is a particle.
Okay.
And we call these oligomers rather than polymers. It's like a step down from a polymer, and it's probably around a nanometer in size, but it's not a solid particle per se. There is a hypothesis that these are the things that are being shed into hot water. And then in the lab, when we filter that hot water, we dry our filter, we look at it under a microscope, or we take a drop of the water and dry it and look at it with our equipment. The particles we see are actually more like precipitates. And that originally in the liquid, they weren't the size we saw. They were much, 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 much smaller.
Much smaller, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. BPA, PFAS, phthalates, are these plastic associated chemicals?
Yes.
Is that,
Yeah.
How do we classify those? Because those are the three that I think get a lot of attention, but are there some
Yeah.
others that perhaps are just not mainstream yet?
Well, I mean, I guess they are a mainstream. At flame retardants are another big class of chemicals.
Wow.
With obviously, you know, flame retarding properties that are prolific in plastics. And here in the UK, we have much stronger or rigorous fire regulations than other places in Europe. So a lot of the materials in the home, for example, like upholsteries, carpets, curtains, have a much higher load of these compounds than other countries across Europe. I think flame retardants, plasticizers, BPA, PFAS, like you say, the antimicrobials, UV stabilizers, heat stabilizers.
Antimicrobials?
Yeah. So like antimicrobials, things to
like things that we put on surfaces and...
Yeah, exactly. So they're part of plastics as well, some plastics, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Heat stabilizers have historically, in the past, have been things like lead, which is obviously being phased out, but same PVC, which is used for, you know, piping, window frames, kind of, it's a much more rigid plastic that had a lot of, first of all, it had a lot of phthalates in it, a very high proportion of phthalates to make it soft and usable, but it also would contain lead heat stabilizers. So I guess when we think of these groups, they're not just, I guess, organic chemicals. It can even include metals as well.
Gotcha.
So they are a real mixture.
Wow.
These materials, yeah.
I don't think I fully appreciated that.
Yeah.
That we're mixing with different materials and stuff, because, you know, you get a lot of these pans and stuff, and they say it's PFAS free, whatever, and they're made out of ceramic, but they have coatings on them.
Yeah.
And these coatings, I'm imagining, are different types of plastics.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about the composition, but I do know that ceramic is quite a loose term in itself. And actually, I think a proportion of that can be some kind of polymer or plastic.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't think ceramic is a thing, if that makes sense.
Right.
It is kind of a blend or a mix of a few different substances.
Gotcha.
And so I think there are just a few pan manufacturers in the world that are actually making things that are sort of toxic, chemical-free pans. But yeah, I mean, any coating, I mean, often what happens in plastics is like for like is replaced. So BPA was a common additive. It was found to have endocrine disrupting properties. It was replaced with something called BPS and I think BPD. They are there to do the same thing. So they have very similar chemical structures and, of course, then actually behave in a very similar way to BPA. Often, chemicals, there are tens of thousands of chemicals in plastics, if not hundreds of thousands. And the smallest proportion of these have been tested.
Gosh.
A lot of them are in use but have not been tested. And then there are mixtures. The mixtures might be doing things or behaving differently or leading to different effects than each compound would alone. So it just becomes a really complicated thing.
This is super complicated because I guess, from a consumer's point of view, if I see a product that is clearly a plastic and it proudly states that it is BPA-free, from your perspective, should we be approaching them with the same degree of suspicion as a BPA containing product?
Well, I mean, I would definitely question what is there in its place.
Sure.
What's in the place of BPA. I guess, if we've perhaps not got the same weight of evidence or evidence base for these replacements as we have for BPA yet, but it takes time and mounting studies to do that. So I would definitely, I personally try and avoid plastic, and it's not just in the particle aspect, it's really driven by the chemicals as well and the mixtures.
Okay. Just as a side note, when did all this start? When did we start using plastics, and when did they become just so commonplace across everything?
So they were invented at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. That was when they were first invented. And I think the very first polymer was called something like cellulite or something.
Okay.
And then there was something called Bakelite.
Okay.
And these very early plastics were designed with very clear functions or applications in mind. So I think it was Bakelite. It was in response to the need for a replacement or substitute for ivory, which was being widely used in like piano keys, billiard balls, and obviously there was hunting and poaching of elephants and rhinos and things, and it was to curb that. So there was a kind of call, if you like, for someone to design or engineer a replacement material, and that's where it came from originally. So like a super specific application in mind. And then I think some of the major chemical companies kind of caught wind of this potential new material and the properties, designed some of the other types of polymers as well. And then it was really during the war that some wider applications were found. So the Second World War, things like tarpaulin, parachutes, helmets, this kind of thing. And so then an economy formed around plastic. And then the war finished and the economy sank post-war, right? And so then there was this real drive to basically invest in plastics and build this plastic economy. And so then mass production began in the 50s. There was this whole, have a convenient life, throwaway lifestyle. You never have to wash up plates again. You can just use these disposable ones. We can use plastic for everything. So it was really a capitalization on, I guess, the remnants of this war-based economy as a boost to then the global economy and that kind of vision, which is where the plastics industry started.
Gosh, that's fascinating, isn't it? It's just crazy how marketing has led to this generation of like a plastic-laden world. And so if we fast forward to today, if you live in London, I live in London, if you're living in an urbanized environment, where do you think the biggest sources of plastic exposure are coming from people living in cities around the world?
So that's really good. So I guess, we think of plastic, right, as these big materials or macro materials, if you like. But when we think about our exposure, aside from the chemicals that are released from these plastics, our exposure is then to these particles, right? And I think that's the interesting thing. The materials were developed for very specific purposes, applications. We considered them safe, but we'd never had to consider that they might get into our bodies. And so I think that's the kind of the interesting aspect in all of this. So they break down into these micro and nanoparticles. These are in the air, they're in our diet. There's a whole range of different sources. In an urban environment, if we consider tyre wear as plastic, then tyre wear is definitely one of the main sources of inhalation exposure. Yeah.
Really? Wow. Just from just cars on the road, lorries.
Yeah. So it's just the abrasion of tyres against the road, braking and different speeds and driving conditions, road surfaces. All of that contributes to the degradation of tyres.
Wow.
You have to replace your tyres, right?
Sure, yeah.
It's because they've been shaved on the road. And there's evidence to suggest that those particles released during that process, some are small enough to be inhaled, some can reach your central airways, and a proportion can reach your deep lung as well.
Gotcha.
And so they're not the main component, but I think they are one of the main components of air pollution in these important size fractions that reach the airways and deep lung.
Gotcha.
And it's predicted to worsen, not necessarily that we're exposed to more, but just as, tailpipe emissions decrease as we get cleaner cars, more electric vehicles, then the proportion of material from the tyres, from the road, from the brake pads, that obviously increases because we've got less of the other stuff coming out of the
Okay, so as a
exhaust.
proportion of pollution, it will increase, but that doesn't mean the absolute amount will increase.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless we, like Sadiq Khan has his way and just removes all cars from the city.
I think there are projections that do predict that the amount is also going to increase because the vehicle fleet is increasing and there's more and more traffic on the roads.
Oh, okay. So no good news.
And also the electric vehicles, whilst there is technology and improvements, they are heavier. So there is more of that type of emission. So it's complicated.
Yeah, it's so complicated because you're like, okay, well, let's all go electric because that's obviously going to be better from a particulate matter perspective, but they're heavier, so there's going to be more plastic in the air. So there's never a solution. It's always a trade-off.
I know, and one problem causes another, or one solution causes a new problem. And, But then another main source of plastic is textiles. Like in our environment, I guess in urban environments, it's people, it's the clothes they wear. Sitting in synthetic upholstery or wearing synthetic materials or walking on synthetic carpets. Again, that all contributes to the wear and breakdown. So I think there was a study which estimated, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of plastic microfibers are released from a person in a day, just from kind of walking about, the wear and tear of clothes, or it's wear that you can't really see. But then it kind of makes sense if you think about dust, right? If you see a dusty surface in your house, so much of that you can see are little fibres, not hairs, but like tiny fibres.
Yeah.
And that's just a bit that you can see. So I think synthetic materials is another key source in urban environments because there are so many people and so much upholstery around us and textiles.
Wow. Okay. So tyres, clothes. We haven't gone down to cups or anything like that yet. But what other key sources would you say?
Dietary sources are another major pathway of our exposure. I guess the thing is, the stuff in the air, there is a connection to the gut anyway, because first of all, some of what we inhale is quite large and isn't small enough to penetrate into our airways and lungs. And so we swallow it, deposits in the nose or mouth, and you quite rapidly will swallow it, and therefore leading to exposure in the gut. Secondly, what is in the air obviously deposits a fraction of the particles in the air will settle out and deposit, and so you might get contamination of food, of drinks and things, and passively ingest things that way as well. But then food is another source, and there are different ways by which food might be contaminated. So first of all, you've got the kind of environmental pathway, if you like. So we'll take seafood as the example. The earliest observations of microplastics were in the sea. And so kind of the evolution of research has come from the sea, like us. Funny. But anyway, and so there's a lot of research looking at shellfish, fish, and sort of other types of seafood that we eat. And that's because microplastic is in the marine environment. These things accidentally ingest it, and then we harvest it, and then we eat it. It's mainly a problem for things with when we eat the gut as well. So a lot of fish, we take out the gastrointestinal tract. The problem is if there's anything in the fillets itself. There are some fish we eat the whole thing, like anchovies and sardines. And then shellfish is obviously the other thing that we eat whole. And so that's very much like a food chain pathway leading to our exposure. And the other option is then, I guess, contamination that happens within a food system, right? So it could be packaging, could be the source of contamination, or it could be a factory environment and the air in the factory, or machine parts, or again the people in the factory. So I think there's kind of the processing, packaging side as one way in which things are contaminated, and then there's the kind of environmental processes leading to transfer in the food chain, which is the other.
Gotcha. What about drinks? So you mentioned packaging there. I mean, drinks and plastic bottles and now water bottles, glass bottles are getting a lot of attention as a source of plastic. Is this a major source of plastic ingestion for us, or is it down the list of things after ones that you've just mentioned?
No, I think for bottled water, it is probably one of the main types when we look at the levels or the amounts found. Tap water, I think generally very low concentrations are found in tap water. If you move to bottled water, it's higher. One of the early studies looking at bottled water, however, first of all found that reusable bottles had a higher microplastic load than single-use plastic bottles, which is quite depressing. But potentially the reuse, this opening and closing, the wear and tear, maybe sheds microplastics, and that's why. But it also found that glass bottles had the highest concentration of microplastics with no plastic component at all.
How does that happen?
So, I mean, clearly the bottle's not the source. That's then a question of, I guess, the source of water or what's going on in the factory, the hygiene. Like, I don't mean hygiene from like an infection perspective. I mean from like a particle perspective. And again, it just points towards other sources of exposure in a food processing or drinks processing environment.
Wouldn't you find the same? Because a lot of these companies have the bottles of the plastic variety and the glass variety, so you'd assume that it's coming from the same source. So surely you'd see a higher amount of plastic either way, because
I'm trying to think. I don't know how they designed their experiment. I don't know if they focused on one brand with two types of packaging, if it was just two different brands, two different factories. I'm not sure, but I think like on average, or at least the highest levels they were finding were thousands of particles or microplastics per litre. And so then if you think in some countries, people just rely solely on bottled water, you have a couple of litres a day every day of your life. That's really why water is one of the main, I guess, sources of exposure relative to other food groups. But also there's a bit of a gap like in the literature around food groups in general. Some are really heavily studied, whereas others are quite understudied. So cereals, for example, meats and proteins there's an increasing number of studies, but again, much fewer than there has been for water, for seafood. And it's, again, probably just the evolution of the field and the progression.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking back to when I was traveling during medical school in Southeast Asia, and I was just living off plastic water bottles because you can't take the risk.
That's it, right? I mean, for some people, some places, like that's the choice, and it's obviously it's not their fault, but I guess we're just becoming aware of this now. But on balance, do you drink a few thousand particles a day, or do you drink an infected water source? So I think then you have to kind of bring in that element of balance. And the reality is, even though it sounds bad, there are some situations where it's probably still the best option, or the best of two bad options, or however you want to look at
no
it.
solution, only trade-offs.
Yeah.
You mentioned clothes as this source of plastic exposure. What kind of materials in clothing are some of the worst offenders, or the commonly used plastics in clothing?
So I think one of the most common types of plastic observed from clothing or from textiles in general is the polyesters.
Okay.
So there's a plastic called polyethylene terephthalate that would be a polyester, but it's also got applications in things like drinks bottles and stuff. So it kind of has a few different applications, but as a fibre, it's one of the most common types. Okay. I guess that's the thing, like we would normally attribute fibres in samples to textiles, carpets, clothing, because where else does that really come from in terms of a product? But for particles, it's much harder. Like you see a particle and you can analyze it. It says it's polyethylene terephthalate or PET, but you can't beyond that say what it's come from. It could have been a bottle. It could have been like a fragment from a fiber. It could have been packaging. It could have been something else. So I think it's quite hard to attribute to sources, apart from if you've got very clearly, you've got fibres.
Yeah.
Another common type is polyamide or nylon.
Okay. Nylon.
That's another one. We, in a study we did in central London, we actually found a predominance of polymer or plastic called polyacrylonitrile.
Okay.
Which is it's like a synthetic wall or acrylic wall material. So generally used for, I guess, more outdoor applications like outwear, tarpaulin. It's more of like one of the more robust plastics. Yeah.
And is that coming from clothing or like other sort of like tents or?
It's hard to say. So we took these samples on a roof in central London, campus rooftop.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So this is 50 meters high.
Okay.
And we found so it suggested the source was possibly from an area with like high footfall, like high population density in the day. So it could have been coming from the people, but also there's so much construction going on in London.
Yes.
And so polyacrylonitrile is also a substitute for asbestos in cement. So they use these they call them carbon fibres, the polyacrylonitrile plastic fibres, to reinforce cement as an asbestos replacement. And so I guess if you've got mixing or aerosolization of a dry formula of this, or you've got demolition, and also tarpaulin, buildings are covered in it, undergoing renovations or construction. So it's really hard to pinpoint down to where that was coming from.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's, you just got the natural elements, wind, when we recently had a storm and stuff, with like high wind, so you don't know where it's coming from in London. You might not be living near a construction site, but if it's 50 meters in the air, there's just going to be all these different currents bringing
definitely. And there are definitely studies which have shown population centers are a source, and then like wind and meteorological patterns can carry it away and move it around to other places geographically, even mid to long range. So
okay, so we've got it come from lots of different clothes. Has this changed your sort of choice of clothing? I mean, we'll get into some of the tips maybe later on, but
I try really hard, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I think there are a couple of conflicts. Like sometimes I'm just very focused on secondhand and like, oh, it's secondhand, great, and I almost forget to think, what's it made of? And then in that scenario, I'm like, is this bad? This is secondhand. It's probably quite worn, and if it's synthetic, is it just going to wear? Is the rate of wear going to accelerate? Right?
Gotcha.
Does it get weaker and weaker? Does more and more fragment as you go and wash it? And I generally try to pick natural materials,
Sure.
like especially if I'm buying something new. So yeah, I do have that in my conscious, I'd say 90% of the time, as with most things. And every so often I have a lapse, and then it's only after as I didn't even think about that.
Check the
You know,
label,
just something comes over you and you're like,
Yeah.
I need that.
Yeah.
Like, I want that. And then it's only afterwards that, but
Yeah.
you know, we're human.
Yeah, totally. And so those natural materials, I'm assuming cotton,
Cotton,
hemp.
yeah. And this is a thing that we were talking about, you know, the kind of one solution could cause another problem.
Yeah.
Because cotton requires so much water. It's not very sustainable, right?
Yeah.
I think hemp's actually like one of the best because I think it sequesters a lot of carbon, and it's very quick to grow and requires less water. So I think hemp's probably the more sustainable one, but I don't think I've got any hemp clothing.
No, I've got some bamboo.
Oh, well, that's okay. Well, yeah, I mean, that's okay, I would say. No, again, it
I'll
comes...
burst my bubble about bamboo.
No. Do you know, I don't honestly know enough about bamboo, but I guess the question is it bamboo fiber in the way that is kind of cotton, or is it bamboo that's been made into like a bioplastic fiber? Do you know what I mean? Is it similar to like cellulose acetate? The carbon comes from plant material, but it's still very much a plastic.
Gotcha.
That's something I don't know about the bamboo stuff.
That's a really
I need
good
to look
point,
into it
because it does feel too good to be true sometimes. I wear these bamboo products. I won't mention the brand, but they do feel really good. I'm like, this is like my athletic wear, but it's made out of bamboo.
Yeah.
So
I'm
is
sure
better.
it's good. Or I mean, it's definitely better than. But again, that comes down to the source of the carbon in it.
Right. Okay.
Because I think still what we don't really know when we think now then about what happens when it gets into the environment or the fibers are shared, do they break down? Like cellulose eventually, right? And probably bamboo then because of that too. But it depends how much, I guess, processing they've undergone, what additives have been incorporated to them, how they've been processed to make the fiber.
Yeah.
But then, like, for us, we don't have cellulase, right? We don't break down cellulose. That's why we poo fiber all the time, you know? So, and the same goes for the airways. So if we were to ingest these fibers or inhale them, then they'd probably, you know, persist in a similar way to plastic. There are just some other characteristics that might make them less harmful. Like they're very flexible, like softer, if you like, compared to a plastic. And so our immune cells that are there to try and clear up the plastics or any foreign material in the body might have an easier job of engulfing a piece of cotton or a fiber of cotton compared to a slightly more rigid but still flexible plastic fiber.
Gotcha. The other thing I was going to ask about clothing was the colouring as well, the dyes.
Yeah.
Are those plastics?
So the dye isn't plastic. The dye is a soluble chemical dye, or not completely soluble because it stays attached to the clothes.
Sure.
But it's not plastic, but it is very much a chemical, and some of them are probably synthetic in origin. Some of them are metal-based, again. So, you know, there's definitely issues with dyes as well. I'm sure some dyes are nicer than others from that respect. Okay. So I would consider dye as like another additive, if you like, or another type of additive.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to come back to some swaps a little bit later, actually, for clothing. But I think for now, if I was just to summarize what we've chatted about, we've determined for the audience, our community, who are really, really interested in this topic as well. We get asked about microplastics a lot, about the different types of plastics that are there, how they creep into our everyday life, particularly if you live in urbanized environments, the fact that they're in the air, our water, our food system, the ocean, obviously. Why don't we dive into the potential impacts on health? And I know this is a difficult sort of topic to tackle because you know the evidence is still in its evolution. But in terms of what we know today, unequivocally, what do we know about microplastics and nanoplastics and how they affect human health?
Well, I mean, I guess like you'd first start that answering this question by thinking about the human based studies, right? Because that really is health, the progression to disease and sort of what's happening in an individual in terms of their, I guess, pathophysiology, if you like. So there have been a few high impact studies recently. I guess the two sort of prominent ones are one study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which detected signatures of plastic in atherosclerotic plaques, so blockages that you get in the artery, normally in your neck. And the prevalence and level of plastic was linked to more adverse outcomes like stroke and heart attack and all these different cardiovascular health endpoints, if you like. And then this was backed up by some image data to show some carbon-based material, essentially, in these plaques.
Okay.
The other paper was on brains. It was published in Nature, and it found quite high quantities of plastic, again, based on signatures of plastic. Both these studies used pyrolysis GCMS, the sort of technique I mentioned earlier, and they found higher levels in the brain than in the liver and kidney, and a suggestion of, I think, an increase over time, possibly some links to dementia or Alzheimer's. The caveat here is the technique, right? Because pyrolysis GCMS looks at breakdown products of plastic. So you take, let's say, polystyrene, you pyrolyze it, and it produces a range of products. And the most key ones are the styrene monomer, its dimer, so two styrenes together, and its trimer. And the trimer has only come from the polymer, polystyrene.
Okay.
Right? And the dimer, the same.
Okay.
However, lots of things produce styrene.
Okay.
If they're pyrolyzed. So it's not very specific as a marker. So we would
when
use...
you say pyrolyzed, so just remind the audience.
So that is, I guess, superheating your sample, if you like, to about 600 degrees to thermally break apart the plastics. So we would never use styrene as a marker because we know that other stuff produces it too. The other two are much more specific to polystyrene. There are some plastics that don't really have a unique marker, that just everything they break down to is fairly non-specific. And one of those has been found to be polyethylene. And actually what some of the products it does break down to in this pyrolysis process actually overlap with fats as well. So if you pyrolyze fats or you pyrolyze polyethylene, you can get an overlap in the products that are produced. So if you take a piece of tissue and it's not fully, processed, or you've not really removed all the tissue and especially the fats within it, potentially some of those are being picked up and classified as plastic.
Gotcha.
For some of these plastics that have quite non-specific markers with this particular technique.
So what we can determine from what you said is that there may be an overestimation?
Maybe an overestimation. That's, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that I guess the images to support these studies, again, don't use techniques that can definitively say this is plastic in structure. It's more like this is a particle, it's not tissue, or this is a particle, it's carbon based.
Gotcha.
So just based on that alone, there's still a grey area.
Okay.
However, there is also lots of historical, occupational epidemiology literature. So from the plastics industries, there's actually quite there is a occupational disease specific to plastic dust inhalation.
Oh, really?
So back to clothing and textiles, there's something called flock, which is it's like shortcut fibers to make a kind of fake suede material. So you can imagine super short fibers. And when these fibers are cut with a rotary mill, it generates a dust which is small enough to be inhaled into the deep lung. And in those settings, there have been outbreaks of a interstitial lung disease, or like a chronic inflammation of the lower airways in your lung. And in worse cases, it has progressed to fibrosis, which is irreversible, compromises the function of the tissue or the organ. But in best cases, has been shown to be reversible if caught early on. You take the worker out of that scenario and the symptoms disappear.
Gotcha.
It's it's rare, like definitely rare. And I guess there's no understanding of whether there's any specific susceptibility in those people who have developed that disease. But it's definitely an example where plastic at high concentrations has led to a pathology and a disease onset.
That's really interesting. I think looking at the occupational hazards of people who work in close contact with these types of fibers can almost be seen through two different lenses. One is like, that's an extreme environment, and whenever anyone is working in an extreme environment, you're always going to get these weird diseases that are really, really horrible for these folks, but it doesn't really have that much. It doesn't give us much information about the sort of like the smaller impact on population.
Totally.
The other way to look at it is, well, this is kind of like the canary in the coal mine, because these are fibers that are being ingested, yes, in high doses over a short period of time. But after listening to everything that you've been talking to me about in terms of the dust inhalation in urbanized environments, can one experience the same issue over a prolonged period of time of 20, 30 years of just breathing smaller amounts of dust?
That's the gold question, really. That's it, isn't it? So, how do you make sense of occupational studies for the general population, low dose or low exposure, but potentially over their whole life course? And that is something we don't know yet.
Okay.
So I have seen studies that have looked at, for example, the level of microplastic in the fluid from people's airways, and they've come. Exactly. So it's bronchial alveolar lavage fluid. So they actually wash your airways with a saline solution and then sort of aspirate it back out. And if you look at that, comparing a healthy group with no disease, and then two groups, one with interstitial lung disease and then one with actually fibrosis, so the kind of worst progression of that disease, they do find an association between microplastic level and the fibrotic pattern of that disease.
Okay.
But, that disease that started potentially years ago, right? It's a kind of a slow-ish, or, well, I don't know how rapid a progression it is, but you need to kind of know what they were exposed to before the onset of the disease. And I guess we need repeated measures. We need to follow people over time. And that's just not been done yet. I guess cohorts, the cohorts that do exist in the world, health cohorts for looking at health questions, potentially do have biosamples linked to them. You could start looking at this, but you have to also address whether the biosamples are contaminated because of how they were collected, if they were sampled without microplastics in mind, because that's another issue. Contamination. Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have some sort of idea potentially of the impact on heart health through some of these studies that you just mentioned, the one in New England Journal of Medicine, brain health, potential links to dementia. What about fertility?
Yeah, well, again, there's many studies on this. I guess it all started from in vivo studies, so experimental control studies in mice, looking at the reproductive system. There's been links to female infertility, male infertility, links to sperm quality. There's suggestion that the particles following ingestion can translocate to the testes. What isn't clear, number one, is whether is it a plastic effect or is it just a high dose of persistent particle, right? Could it be any non-degradable, non-digestible particle of that size range? Would you see the same effect?
So whether this is metals or any sort of...
Or I guess glass, like something completely inert.
Sure,
Just, would you see the same thing? Is it just a load of particles driving this? Another is whether the effects are, secondary. Like, is this an indirect effect triggered by systemic inflammation, for example? So the particles are in the gut, they trigger an inflammation which progresses to something systemic, and you're looking at a secondary effect as a result of that. I think the presence of the particles in testes is meant to demonstrate this is a direct effect. They're getting here and exerting this effect. But the particles observed in testes are quite large, right? They're like 5 microns upwards. And when we think about particle kinetics in the body relative to size, you would expect a much higher proportion to be much smaller, right? The smaller the particle, the greater the likelihood of translocation. And so whether there is a plausible mechanism that lets particles of that size cross the gut, circulate, and then enter the testes, I think still remains to be proven. The final aspect is whether it's a particle or chemical effect.
Okay.
Right? So is it something about the physical presence of the particle and the properties of that particle, its surface chemistry, its shape, its size? Is it triggering inflammation because it's a foreign material? Or is it actually its chemical load, if you like?
Yeah.
Is there a leaching of a chemical at a high dose, because these animals are given a high dose, that is enough to migrate to these tissues and trigger these effects? So there's real big question marks still to look into.
Given what we know about bisphenol A, so BPA, and its endocrine disrupting effects, are most people in this field, like yourself, of the mind that it's most likely going to be having a double effect? So potentially the particle itself causing localized and systemic inflammation, plus the chemical impact on
so
hormones.
I think, I guess mechanistically, yes, right, that's plausible. And especially in experimental studies where we dose cells or animals at high concentrations, higher than we'd experience every day. But then in an everyday scenario for human exposure, I think the studies that have at least started to model chemical release and exposure from microplastics, it suggests that the microplastic concentration isn't high enough, or the chemical load in the microplastic isn't high enough to really lead to something significant. And actually exposure to these chemicals from other sources, just like as a free chemical released from food packaging into the food, or rather than hijacking or hitchhiking, on a plastic particle, is more influential. But I think in these experimental studies where there's a really high concentration or high dose of one type of plastic, there probably is a high enough concentration of chemical present too. But again, so
that's experimental.
Exactly, the extrapolation's challenging.
Can these microplastics cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain?
Well, I mean, again, some studies suggest this. It comes down to particle size, right? I know that people working in drug delivery really struggle to get stuff across this barrier.
Sure, yeah.
It's like their holy grail. They're like, how do I get drugs into the brain? To the point that they're looking at like liposomes and small biological molecules. I think the studies that have looked at blood-brain barrier permeation and microplastics, obviously all experimental, are using particle sizes, nanoparticles, but still a bit larger than one would expect being able to cross. I think the other question is, when you look at, say, a tissue section for plastics, the presence of plastics and where they are in the brain, you really need to have the histopathological context, right? You need to have some kind of parallel staining of that tissue to show, look, here's the endothelium, this is the blood vessel, these are cells, this is just your sort of whatever tissue you're looking at. And for some microplastic studies, that's missing. So the question of whether the particles are in brain tissue or just in vessels and the vasculature of the brain is something else that hinders our understanding of whether they actually penetrate, right?
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to disease state as well. Not everyone's healthy, or you might think you're healthy, but you have an underlying condition. Systemic inflammation can increase the permeability of our barriers. So that could be one explanation for observing it in the brain, for example.
Gotcha. So it's the inflammation caused by the particles, perhaps via the gut, that might be leading to a leakier brain.
Yeah, exactly. Or
words.
It doesn't even have to be, in the experimental settings, yes.
Sure.
In an everyday exposure for us, for example, we're exposed to all sorts of stuff. not just microplastic,
Mm-hmm.
and lots of things which have the potential to trigger inflammation, exacerbate, lead to chronic inflammation, and again that can lead to these leakier barriers.
Yeah. Obviously, this is going to be a very, it's extremely multifactorial, and I don't think anyone will suggest that plastics are causing cancer. But is there a role for plastics in cancer and our increasing exposure to plastics in the environment?
So I think, generally they have been considered chemically inert. So it could be something linked to the persistence of the particle. If you have a chronic inflammation somewhere that persists, that can lead to aberrant repair mechanisms. It can lead to mutagenicity. It can lead to cancer. And that's a hypothesis formed in a field of respiratory toxicology called around particles that are poorly soluble and low toxicity.
Okay.
This idea that it's more the persistence and the body trying to get rid of that and then leading to this chronic inflammation that could potentially lead to that. But I think it's very much potential, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
I don't think there are studies that demonstrate that specifically for plastic.
Okay.
It's more a theory from other fields of research.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And those sort of the forever chemicals, PFAS, phthalates, BPA, and the other types of BPA, are those shown to have some of those, maybe not even the mutagenetic effects, but obesogenic effects, and that could be contributing to the risk of cancer?
Yeah, totally. So like phthalates, for example, have been shown to interfere with lipid metabolism. There are certain receptors that they interact with. They're known as one of many obesogenics. So yeah, absolutely. There's that kind of pathway, I guess. Yeah. Kind of creating this obese environment in people that then could lead to these different pathologies and diseases.
Yeah. It's tough, isn't it? Because like you got to map this against the background of an increase in ultra processed food consumption that just happens to be wrapped in plastic and might be contaminated with all these different plastics. So to separate that out in observational studies is just so tough. Really
hard, totally. Yes. It's interesting. So I was reading some papers the other day on microplastic studies in stool, and these studies that have started to explore dietary behaviors or links to dietary patterns. And looking across food groups, at least one study in Norway, I think they compared a seafood versus no seafood diet.
Okay.
Right. Thinking seafood's probably a prominent source. And they actually found no effect from food group whatsoever for comparing those two groups. But what they did find, which has also been mirrored in another study, is that actually whether the food is processed or ultra processed seems to have more of a link to the level of microplastic than the dietary composition.
Really? Wow. So the degree of ultra processed foods in your diet is more likely to be an indicator of how much plastic you're being exposed to.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting.
It is. But like you say, then, it's hard to then sort of disentangle what is driving the obesity. Is it multifactorial? Is it just that they're both confounders? Is it variables? Are they interacting and exacerbating this? And you've got the obese environment, you've got the chemicals, you've got the particles, and it is definitely hard to disentangle.
Definitely. Yeah. I want to talk about accumulation in a second, but aside from me donating some of my tissue to you to then examine in the lab, is there an easy, accessible consumer tool or test that we can do today to determine the level of plastics that we have in our body?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I have heard of commercial blood tests.
Okay.
They do finger prick tests, but I don't know the technology behind this, right? And from my experience in the lab and working on blood, we're developing or optimizing rather methods to detect microplastic in blood and quantify it. And the reality is, if you're looking in that smaller volume,
Tiny,
the level of microplastic has to be so high for it to be
Yeah.
detectable, number one. But number two, for it to be rapid, I suspect they're just relying on fluorescent stains potentially, which aren't necessarily specific to plastic. They will stain plastic, but they will stain other stuff too, because they're lipophilic dyes. So anything that's hydrophobic or any lipid in your sample will stain. That's just a guess. I don't know the exact technology, but my feeling is you probably can't do it in a finger prick's worth
What
of
about
blood.
if I gave you like a vial of
Yeah,
venous blood?
yeah. Again, I'm not. I don't know if there's a commercial company. I mean, there must be a commercial company doing this, right?
Sure.
There has to be. But
I'm
yeah,
not aware of any,
we
but yeah.
can do it in a mil.
Okay.
And that there are publications on this.
Okay.
Typically 1 mil of whole blood, maybe a few repeats from you.
Okay.
That blood is then digested or liquefied, if you like, in the lab. We use chemical reagents or enzymes, and then that's filtered into a very fine filter, and then theoretically plastic is resistant to the enzymes or to the chemical reagents, and is therefore concentrated onto the filter.
Okay.
And so then we analyze the filter with our two different techniques. We can say how much is in the blood and how many particles and what shape and size and polymers, plastics they are.
Gotcha. Okay. But you probably wouldn't be able to determine source, like this is coming most likely from
not really.
Tarpaulin or... Yeah.
Not just on that spot analysis, but again, you'd have to then design a study. If you could have multiple groups, for example, based on their diet, you could have a group of ultra-processed diet people, a group of healthy diet people, measure their blood, see if there's a link. We could analyze the food. Like it would be, a study designed to look at that, I guess. To look at sources. But I think the complexity as well is microplastic isn't just in food, it's in the air. And so blood's great because it integrates whatever you've inhaled and whatever you've ingested, as long as it's bioavailable and can cross our epithelial barriers, right? It can cross the gut, it can cross the lung, then we can see it in blood. But then to then understand where they're coming from, you would need to have information on their inhalation exposure and their dietary exposure, which is huge.
Yeah, totally. And as you were saying that, I was just thinking, aside from like people wearing masks and stuff and like determining how much they're actually ingesting through air, you might want to look at stool samples to look at some of the bigger plastics that won't cross that gut barrier. And then maybe even urine. Do they accumulate in urine?
Well,
at all,
that's the thing. There are a few studies that say there's microplastic in urine.
Really?
But
Gosh.
You'll know more than me because you did medicine. But I'm sure there's something called like the glomerular or glomerular filter or something. Something that's like a membrane essentially in your
kidneys,
tubes, whatever. I think sort of 8 nanometers is the pore size, or 6 to 8 nanometers. So like that's the size of material that should be getting through into urine. And at that point, is it even a plastic particle? I don't know. Who knows? It's philosophical, but and it would be very hard to detect. Like for particles of that size, you'd have to have such a high amount for the mass to be detectable. And the microscopy techniques or the microspectroscopy techniques I'd previously mentioned, the resolution is not that. Where orders of magnitude, we're talking 300 nanometers minimum. Because
we're not talking about water-soluble chemicals here, are we?
No, exactly.
We're talking about physical particles. So where you might be able to measure pesticide residues in urine, you shouldn't really be seeing these big, unless you've got damage to your kidneys, in which case you might be seeing big particles like blood or even sugar molecules that shouldn't be in your urine either. So it'd have to be really, really small.
Or you're really, really sick.
Or you're sick. In which case plastic is probably the least of your worries at that point.
Exactly. It's so true.
Do we have an idea of the dose of plastic that we can actually handle? Again, this is a very difficult question.
Gosh, I would say no at the moment, because I think we're still trying to get to grips with how much we're exposed to.
Yeah.
And, depending on the study or the estimate and the studies used to reach that estimate, it can vary from no microplastics up to billions of microplastics, depending on what's included. So it's really challenging to know what our baseline exposure is right now. I think one of the stronger studies that tries to derive this estimate uses probabilistic modeling. So it looks at data across literature, across different food groups, the size distributions, all of this, and, integrates that. Well, sort of first of all uses that to then build a distribution of microplastics from each of those exposure sources. And then it takes information about how much we eat of each of these, the sort of dietary patterns, like physiology, all of this stuff. And I feel like the estimates are, micrograms or tens of micrograms per week, which is so much less than a 5 gram credit card per week.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of baseline we're working with. And then don't really even know, what diseases it's been, concretely linked to. And so I think we're quite far away, at least, another 5 years or so.
Gotcha. That 5 grand credit card number, that was debunked, wasn't it? It was crazy high amount.
It was,
and I think
very
it was
high.
because I remember coming across that and thinking, I can't be eating a credit card every week. That just sounds ridiculous.
Exactly. Yeah, it was debunked. And so I think, the reality is it's more, I don't know, hundreds of micrograms.
Gotcha. Yeah. A lot smaller.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about some scary topics.
Yes.
It's basically everywhere. There's potential health impacts, even though we can't be sure. As a pragmatist, I would say better to avoid something than to learn about the negative impacts of said exposure after 10, 15 years when you can't do anything about it.
Right.
And particularly as these things accumulate in our body as well. I don't know if you can speak to this idea of accumulation or bioaccumulation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess once you know where these things or how they distribute in the body, if you've got a repeat exposure every day of your life, for example, a proportion of that is going to reach that location and build up and build up. And I think that's where we need to be thinking. So I'm interested in the liver, for example, as a clearance organ in the body. But the liver's huge and it's heterogeneous. So how you would even start to look at the liver is complicated. I think things like lymph nodes, where again, we know you get clearance of material via the immune system and a bit of a storage going on. I think that's interesting. The spleen, it's involved in clearance related to the immune system. I think these would all be really interesting organs to study and to start to consider the longer term effects, because accumulation is possibly occurring to a threshold, if you like, where you might then tip over into some adverse effects. And I guess it also suggests that age is also an important factor.
Absolutely.
Right? The older we get, potentially the more we have in our body, because it is persisting and accumulating somewhere.
Totally. And as everyone is sort of obsessed with longevity and aging better these days, myself included, to be honest, but I'm not a biohacker.
No.
I think, this comes into consideration in terms of our exposures and how that makes us more susceptible to things like DNA breaks and hormone disruption and inflammation in general. That tends to creep up as we age.
But what I would say with respect to accumulation, I guess the first step is actually crossing the barrier.
Sure.
And focusing on the gut. Let's focus on the gut because we're interested in food and the diet. There are 2 ways by which that can happen. One is called persorption. Persorption. It was a theory formulated in the 60s and 70s by a German researcher called Volkheimer, who did lots of experiments on various animals and people and found, at least for non-digestible starch particles ingested in a capsule, around 200 milligrams of the stuff in individuals, that he could detect those particles in blood within 10 minutes of exposure, with a peak at around 30 minutes, I think, following exposure. And those were large particles up to, I think, 130 microns in size.
Okay.
Right? Which is substantial.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's like a grain of sand. However, the number of particles detected relative to what was ingested indicate it's a really, 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 really low rate.
Gotcha.
So I think 0.002% of the original ingested particles actually made it into the blood via this mechanism.
Okay.
So it's plausible for larger particles to absorb across, but it's very unlikely. So there's a mechanism in place for it, but the likelihood is super low.
Okay.
The other way is a more active transport, where you've got cells, specialist cells throughout your intestine and small intestine that actually engulf particles, on the micron scale. And then whether the particles kind of sit in the mucosa or just below the lining of your gut, or they actually are shuttled into the lymphatics or into the blood.
Would that be by like translocation? So
exactly, yeah. So there are some regions in the gut called the Peyer's patches, which you probably know. They have these specialized cells called M cells, which have these big folds on their surface, like plicated folds or structure, and they are there to essentially engulf micron-sized material from the lumen. And it's actually believed that this is part of an immune homeostasis surveillance thing that our body does, which is super fascinating and a side story. It's amazing. So, it does it to see if there's any, I guess, like bacteria present that we need to raise an immune response to.
Yeah.
So it samples particles from the lumen to sort of check it out and see what's going on.
That's so cool, isn't it?
Isn't it?
We did a podcast on leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability, and just the sort of the gut barrier itself and the mechanisms that we have whereby particles can go sort of shifting in between the epithelial cells as well as like through the cell via things like translocation. But I don't think I fully appreciated the fact that they might be taking little samples of what's going on in the lumen to like, okay, let's just do a little random sample, make sure that there's nothing dodgy going on. If there is anything that's going to come into the bloodstream, we've mounted an immune response and we're ready and waiting for it just in case.
Exactly. And
that's so cool.
It gets a little bit better.
All right, go on.
So higher up in the intestine, before this region, we actually secrete, I think it's calcium and phosphorus. I hope it's something like that. But actually form calcium phosphate precipitates.
Okay.
So our body secretes elements that then make little particles in our intestine that gain a coating that are then sampled later on by our cells.
Right.
So it's like we have this little system in place, like we actually make particles to gain it, to sample what's going on in the gut.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh
so there's a researcher in Cambridge, Jonathan Powell, who's done all of this, and it's mind blowing.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
The sort of, just the body itself and just how like dynamic it is and how it has all these little like side quests going on.
Yeah.
Like you just think about digestion, like I did at medical school. It's mainly roughage. We get rid of a bunch of stuff through it, and actually there's a whole bunch of different things going on simultaneously. It's incredible. But
so there are these plausible mechanisms, as then you've heard on previous shows, of how particles can cross the gut, and then I guess from there they distribute either in the lymph system or in blood circulation, and then the restriction there I guess becomes vessel size, capillary size, and that kind of thing, whether they cross the endothelium again, and I guess that kind of particle journey, right? Where do they go? Where do they end up? I think it's fascinating, but like kind of a big question mark for microplastic, especially for the different types of plastic, the different shapes, and then the sizes as well.
Yeah.
But while a lot of the studies that have found microplastic in different tissues around the body, the sizes of those particles do challenge these established theories. They're like often very large. And so a real question mark is, where is all the small stuff that we know it's much more likely for this translocation to happen? whereas we're seeing something of a larger size distribution, which is more unlikely. So is it really there? Is it contamination? Are we just at the methodological limits? Like, where is the smaller stuff?
Yeah, where is the smaller stuff? Wow, okay, that's scary. Okay, so pragmatically thinking about avoidance. So unless we're going to all move from urbanized environments where there's less tires, it doesn't seem like that's something that we can actually pragmatically avoid. In terms of like what a listener has control over their exposures, where would you say is a good place to start given the largest exposures that we've detailed before?
So, I mean, we're consumers, right, at the end of the day. And I think it's just making, I guess, different decisions or choices in what you're buying, what you're using, what you're putting in your environment. So obviously we've spoken about synthetic materials, clothes, carpets, upholstery, the indoor environment in general. And
actually, I'll give a shout out to a clothing brand that I've just started using. No affiliation with them whatsoever. I found them whilst I was in my trip in LA.
Oh yeah.
They're called Industry of All Nations.
Okay.
Terrible name. But they use organic cotton from Indian sort of master millers, and they don't use dyes. They use a sort of natural dyeing method. So they cut. So if you buy coloured versions, they sort of appear to be sort of almost like tie dyed, like 1960s, because it's an imperfect dye. But their natural cotton is like a beige material because that's the true colour of cotton. So they don't bleach it or anything. So I've been using those, and I'm trying to keep those for as long as possible because they don't have any microplastics in them. So anyway, I've been using that as an aside.
No, amazing. I think that's the thing, isn't it? So like, I think if you want to prevent microplastic exposure, then you obviously look to alternative materials, and that would probably be natural materials.
Sure.
And I guess, it's just, again, there's the trade-off, right? You expose yourself to less microplastics, but then there are questions, what's the most sustainable option?
Yeah.
Like you say, you've got dyes to think of, you've got additives, you've got where it's come from. And so it's multifaceted, but simply like plastic is the source of microplastic. So use less plastic. Don't heat anything up in plastic.
So don't use a microwave with plastic Tupperware.
No, I just would not
that.
do that. And that's from the chemical perspective as well. I think minimize plastic in your home environment. Walk down quiet side streets to avoid tire wear. You know, like the way you'd avoid air pollution. I could say open your windows, ventilate your home, but maybe you live next to a main road. So there's just so many trade-offs, but which is why it's hard, right? And picking your battles is really hard. And I think until there's some like giant life cycle assessment of like all these different options, or it's hard to know which the best is. But from a microplastic exposure angle, it's clear.
Yeah.
It becomes less clear if you've also then got like a carbon footprint angle or a water footprint, or are you making a new pollutant, or so it's tricky.
In terms of like personal care products, I know we haven't actually talked about this.
Okay.
But makeup, shower gels, shampoos, a lot of them, or many of them now, stating again really proudly phthalate free, PFAS free, all these different sort of buzzwords. But they're in plastic bottles themselves.
Yeah.
So is that going to leach into the actual material? Is that something?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I've seen any studies. I'm sure there will be studies looking at the contribution of the packaging to it. And I guess to a degree, there's probably always some leftover plastic dust from just the forming and the moulding and the factory environment, the cutting and everything that goes on. It's just whether it will be any higher, I don't know, because of the contents of it.
Sure.
So at least for food and migrating chemicals, the fattier the product or the more oily, the greater the migration and partitioning of chemicals to the food in it. And then we know that heat as well also obviously encourages this migration. So it might be less so for personal care products, but I have no doubt that there's probably some ingredient or filler in there, which is a synthetic organic polymer. It's just not one of the more mainstream materials that we use.
Yeah.
There was a ban on intentionally added microplastics to personal care products. So for a period of time, they were intentionally added as an exfoliant.
Oh yeah, the microbead stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's been banned, I think, across Europe, in California, and other countries around the world.
Yeah.
So theoretically, personal care products produced today shouldn't contain intentionally added microplastic, but that doesn't address potential contamination happening. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Super fascinating, because even like things like toothpaste that's in a plastic bottle, and you know, I got a shower gel and I love the shower gel, but then I was preparing for this chat, and it just got me thinking it's in a floppy plastic like dispenser, so clearly there's some plastic getting in there.
Possibly.
And you mentioned the fattier the product, the more migration of plastic. So does that mean
plastic additives? That's
plastic
so the
additives.
chemicals.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So an olive oil in a plastic bottle, is that something that
would most likely have that bottle, the release of chemical additives would be greater than if it were water, for example.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So oil and plastic bottles, avoid, go for glass.
Yeah.
And that, I guess that's the same for things like dressings that have lots of oils in as well. They will have like an olive oil base. Marinades that again have like fats in.
I mean, glass. And again, great from the plastics angle, but glass is heavier, so there's a higher fuel emission. So, but for sure, like I just don't want to be advocating.
I know what you mean.
Am I advocating something that's bad overall? Like this is why it's just such a minefield, right? But from the chemical side, yes, like glass 100%. If that's your goal, minimize chemical exposure, then glass is definitely better, because it's glass, right? It's very inert. I think on the chemical side, I don't know. I think the problem is that there are so many chemicals and so many untested, and some that are just there because they happen to be impurities or products of other chemicals reacting that they're generally unknown. Like we don't, like the producer, the manufacturer of the material wouldn't even know they were there.
Yeah.
I guess like a lot of the main chemical classes or types that we consider of concern will have been tested. Like there will be food migration data, risk assessment, that kind of thing. But I think like the problem is then, as I say, it's not just the exposure from the oil, it's exposure from everything we eat that comes in packaging, it's exposure to chemicals and particles, and then all these other chemicals that no one even knows what they are because they're there as impurities. And the mixture, I think that's like the kind of the real issue.
Okay. So I'm avoiding plastic bottles personally. I know it's going to have an environmental cost. I appreciate that, but it's really good to bring in the nuance, because otherwise it just seems very black and white, and of course it's not. It's just
and
like
there just might be someone listening who's like, but you know what you actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Athleisure wear is a big one for me, because I'm in the process of moving all of my athleisure wear from some of the materials that you mentioned earlier, polyesters, nylon, to cotton, because this is when you're generating heat yourself, you're sweating, you're moving really vigorously. So obviously you're going to be shedding a lot of these plastic materials. Would that be a pragmatic choice? You think?
100%. We actually did a study once in a gym environment, and we looked at levels of microplastic in the air. This isn't published yet. We're trying to publish it. We'll write it up. But we did find like there was microplastic in the air in the gym, and it was predominantly polyamide, which is nylon, and lycra, that kind of material. So we did think it was coming more from people, from the apparel wear than anything else. But you've got all the machinery as well. So I think it's great to think about the clothing, because that is definitely a source that you can have, like you say, control over and change, whereas like the machinery is a bit more it's just what it is.
Yeah.
In your gym.
You should 100% get that published. That's going to go viral.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, like all these like manufacturers of clothes, like Lululemon and Vuori and all these folks, like having to really think about the composition of what they're producing.
And this is the thing, right? So I think so many people in industry who are so on board and want to change and do what's good. But I do also, I'm curious, like, have these tests been done? Like, do fabric engineers or like textile manufacturers do wear tests? Does this data exist from a simulated scenario? You know, because I know for carpets, for example, there are regulatory or standardized testing to test how it wears.
Really?
And you kind of have a fake foot and like on a piston, and it just kind of. And I guess you can look at, you know, how long it's going to last and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I do wonder if there's a similar thing in place for like sports wear.
Totally.
Because it is obviously something that we would be wearing more, as in that would wear more from what we're doing in it.
I always remember going to an IKEA store and they had one of those pistons. And it was like one of their chairs chopped in half. And it was just this piston going. And it was like, oh yeah, it's pretty hard wearing this chair. I'm gonna buy that at £50.
It's been going for 10 years. So like 10 years and 2 seconds.
Yeah.
I
mean, they probably have wear and tear simulation from a macro perspective, because a lot of these companies actually have like lifetime guarantee, but I doubt they're testing the plastic shedding.
You never know. You'll probably get loads of people calling in now, like actually, we have this data and they're fine.
I don't know. I'll be really, really intrigued when you publish that study, because that I think is going to be a real eye opener for lots of people. And I feel like I'm kind of early in this, and I'm like one of those woo woo people who have like trying to change everything in their kitchen and like moving to non-toxic cookware and. We haven't talked about pans yet, but like we actually changed all of our pans to 100% unseasoned stainless steel.
Oh yeah, nice.
But we do have one pan that's non-stick for pancakes.
Oh yeah,
it's just really hard to do. I mean, you can do it with pancakes. You can do it, but it does take a little bit more oil and a bit more effort and a bit of getting used to it. And it's just very simple to do it on a non-stick, but especially if you're doing crepes, it's very hard to do in stainless steel. But is that something that you would say is advisable as well?
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, like, so the pan coating is Teflon, right? Teflon's the main sort of, I guess, trademarked coating. It's polyfluorotetraethylene, which is PTFE, which is under the PFAS grouping, which is quite interesting because it is a polymer, a fluoropolymer, but PFAS then, it's all substances, so you have fluorochemicals and polymers, which we would think of as more solid materials. And there's studies to show, the particle release from heating, from using it. Interestingly, there was a study done by a group in Dublin looking at PTFE particle release from new bakeware. And I think they found that actually like the first kind of couple of uses or heating cycles in the oven actually released most of the material, and then it kind of plateaued.
Oh, interesting.
So, I mean, I personally, and I don't know if this is an emotional response or a scientific response, but I would probably go for the one without the chemicals present.
Sure.
But I think if you were to use non-stick, I think maybe go through a few heat cycles, like put it in the oven, heat it up, let it incubate for a bit, take it out with nothing in it. If you do that a few times, wash it in between, that actually might minimize then what's released moving forward.
That's a really good tip. Yeah, because we still have some non-stick baking items in our kitchen as well, just again for ease.
Yeah.
We haven't moved to like cast iron completely, but I'm probably on my way to that actually. Yeah. Okay, tap water. This is a common question we get. I've actually started using a reverse osmosis filter at home as a countertop one. Kind of expensive. It's about £350, £400. But we use it every single day. And I think we made this choice because of our little one. So we are using, when my wife was breastfeeding, we're a hybrid between that and the milk powders, so the formula. And we thought, okay, well, we'll just do everything in our power to reduce exposure, given that he's literally drinking this every single day.
Yeah, it's good.
What do you make of these reverse osmosis filters or water filters in general?
Yeah, I mean, I want one, I guess. And now I feel bad that I don't have one. But no, like I have, previously filtered water. For me, I think it's probably more of the chemical side of things than the microplastic side. Although there is microplastic in water. It's just a very low concentration. And, often the filters are made of plastic. And so there's that whole kind of tension of like, is this better or not? But I think definitely from a cleaner chemical perspective, like I'm all for the filtration unit. I know you can also get those like carbon sticks that you just kind of stick in your flask or water bottle, whatever. And again, it's kind of absorbs chemicals within it. Because I think, the water companies do monitor chemicals, but a very restricted class that are kind of priorities. We know they're harmful. We know we have to watch these levels, but there's probably a whole range of other stuff in the background at lower levels that aren't on the radar, we don't know about yet, or we do know, but we don't really know if they're harmful or not. So I think at least a preventative measure, it's, always better. Like there's always going to be a benefit.
Yeah, I actually want to get someone to talk about water on the pod, actually.
Amazing. I know someone.
Oh, do you?
He's great.
Okay, great. We'll talk. We'll talk after for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, he's a water chemical man.
Okay, great.
Person, yeah.
I've also heard that we should be using non-marine salt because of the concentration of plastic in the sea.
Yeah. I mean, there are studies that find microplastics in rock salt too, but I guess it's higher in marine derived salt. And again, if you want to minimize your exposure, then yes. But I think I guess the overall contribution it would have to your microplastic burden would be quite small. The levels are quite low. It's not like we use loads of salt on a daily basis. So I guess it all is in balance again. Like if you want to do everything you can, then obviously that's one way of minimizing exposure.
Sure.
But if you kind of I wouldn't say it's the main problem, if you like.
Yeah, I personally love my sea salt, so I'm just going to go for that, the flakes, and I'll take the microplastic burden.
And I don't know enough about the sea salt, like the other benefits, right, from a mineral perspective. Is there any advantage to it, or from a cleaner perspective in terms of the chemicals or metals or anything else? I don't know enough about.
And even with the rock salt and the pink Himalayan salt, there's a lot of fake pink Himalayan salt.
Really?
Yeah, there's a lot of fake food in general. Like Manuka honey is a big issue. Olive oil is a big issue. There's like tons of like fraudulent behavior across these really popular high priced items. So I'm always a little bit skeptical on the whole Himalayan salt thing. I'm sure it's great, but like we were talking about earlier, you can't get away from plastics. And just because it's been sourced away from the sea doesn't mean that plastic hasn't come by the air route.
Yeah, totally. That's it, isn't it? Right. And it kind of ties back into those studies that have found that actually it's the level of processing that seems to have the stronger influence on the amount of microplastic we're exposed to, at least as indicated through what's eliminated in stool. So yeah, I guess like that's something to consider, like the level of processing this food's undergone. And is it ultra processed or, less processed? And I guess the more processed, that could be a better way to avoid microplastic exposure of that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. We mentioned earlier different types of animal-based proteins, so fish. And I think that's really pragmatic, making sure that you are at least having the fillet and not the whole fish, because that's, where they're going to be concentrating those plastics. Are fish the worst types of proteins to consume from a plastic perspective, or is it just that we don't know enough about meat? And
but do you know what? I came across a study recently from a group over in the States or possibly Canada who had compared 11 different protein products, including fish and meat and plant-based products. And I'm trying to remember which one was worse and I can't. but it's definitely understudied compared to other food groups.
Sure.
Well, shellfish is very much studied, so crabs, lobsters, clams, like other bivalves, mollusks, mussels, scallops, and fish. So I guess your commercial fish species. Tap water is something else that has been quite heavily studied, and I think from that perspective, it's because it's quite easy. You filter it and then you go. Whereas with food, you've got to get rid of the food and you've got to extract the microplastic from it. I know there are studies now on fruits and vegetables, on rice and some cereals. So we're starting to put some evidence to these understudied groups. But I think it still suggests that things like water is one of the main exposure pathways.
Okay, so even fish, so shellfish, mussels, all the stuff that I love to eat, sardines, anchovies, herring, all the high omega-3 types of fish that I actually recommend as well. People should be consuming more of. Do they...
There must be a way of calculating. You could have a little microplastics calculator, right?
Yeah,
you should have your dietary recommendations and the literature data and kind of see what the microplastic exposure would be. And then, I don't know, we need to have a tipping point of, a threshold or a traffic light system of when is it okay? When should we actually not recommend this anymore?
Yeah.
I guess, so shellfish, I think... are a worst case scenario than your fish fillets, and that's because we eat the whole shellfish, gut and all. They do undergo a depuration period, so a period where they're incubated in clean water before they're sold, and that's to void their gut and excrete anything in their gut. But I think it's not 100% efficient for plastic. I think there were some very early studies that looked at that experimentally. But I think on the fish side, it would be the sardines, as we've spoken about, where you still have the gut present.
Gotcha.
And a lot of studies that look at fish and levels in fish do look at the gut content rather than the fillet or mussel content, whereas often we'll eat the mussel and not. There are some studies that find microplastics in mussel in the fillets, but again, the sizes of the particles are quite large.
Right.
So it's quite possible that they've just come from the atmosphere, the processing, or something like that.
Rather than actually in the
rather
meat
than
itself.
through the food chain.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So watch this space. I'd love to look at that study actually that you
happy to share.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think I'll share the protein one and the fish one with
that would be
you.
brilliant. That'd be awesome. Okay. And finally, I'd love to know a bit more about the way in which we can manage plastics in the body. How do we actually naturally get rid of plastics?
Okay.
So
I guess we either inhale them or ingest them. And I think I'll just, again, focus on the gut because of the dietary angle and interest. But we've evolved, right, with particles in our environment and solid particles that we can't necessarily digest or degrade. So I guess our body is quite good at keeping things out, and we also have our microbiome, and so our gut is actually kind of well defensed, I would say, and quite tight. However, that doesn't mean that stuff can't get through. But anyway, I guess what I'm saying is most of what we ingest is probably eliminated, right, within stool and feces. I think a small proportion will be absorbed across the gut, and that's dependent on size, or I'd say the likelihood is governed by the size of the particle. It's kind of what we talked about. For particles that are, say, 1/10 of a millimeter in size, it's a low likelihood. 0.002% of those ingested will cross the gut.
Gotcha.
The smaller particles, and this is around 1,000th of a millimeter, so around a micron in size, the likelihood starts to increase, and it increases as it gets smaller. And then from there, it is then kind of dependent on whether they enter the lymphatics or the blood, right? We have the portal vein going from the gut to the liver. So I guess stuff in the bloodstream will be cleared or will enter the liver. We have Kupffer cells in the liver, which are like resident macrophages, so immune cells that are there to kind of engulf and clean up debris and foreign material. However, they're not necessarily 100% efficient.
Okay.
And so I imagine of the what I will call bioavailable microplastic, right, the stuff that does reach the blood, some of it will bypass the liver and redistribute elsewhere. And so we do have these studies reporting on plastics in placenta, in kidney, in lymph fluid, and I don't know, all sorts of different tissues. In fact, it seems like every tissue that's being studied has microplastic in. But then there's the conflict of the particle size distribution in these tissues, not quite matching up what is at least mechanistically believed to be possible.
Right.
So there's still like lots of knowledge gaps and question marks.
Sure.
And as I say, where it accumulates is really important. But on the clearance side, I think we've got, the liver from the blood, as I said, lymph nodes and spleen from the lymph system or immune system, but a large proportion will probably just be eliminated as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I eat more fiber in my diet, would that help accelerate the excretion of plastics and toxins in general?
That's a good question. I don't know is the answer. I mean, possibly. But I think, I guess we've not even spoken about mucus, right? The mucus lining of the gut as well. That's that's actually like your first line of defense.
Sure, yeah.
And a particle's got to get through the mucus to get then into the epithelium. So I don't know if there's anything you can do to have healthier mucus.
Or... Oh, yeah, loads.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
well,
like soluble fiber and hydration and making sure that you're getting probiotics, because all these different microbes, as you know, your colleague Dr. James Kinross will tell us about, can support that mucin layer to make sure that the barrier is protected.
Oh, yeah, I'll say that. Do that.
Okay, do that.
and then also... I guess back to the microbiome, you have dysbiosis or, change in the function or loss of diversity. That could lead to inflammation and that can make your barriers more permeable, as you've heard about leaky gut in previous shows. So I guess like supporting a healthy microbiome, supporting a healthy mucus lining, those are things that should really keep the gut tight and minimize penetration.
Gotcha. Are there any things that we can do to support the liver's activity at removing things like,
Yeah, do you know, I don't know much about the liver. I'm not even going to try and pretend that it's someone else's organ. I'm definitely not a liver, a hepatologist or a hepatotoxicologist, however you say it. But I mean, I guess anything. But the thing is, once these particles are taken up into the liver, what happens? And, I guess a real area of research that's needed is whether the enzymes in the liver are capable of degrading plastic. What does it degrade to? Is that harmful? Or does this plastic just sit with these cells? Is there surrounding inflammation? Does that progress? So I think, we need a lot more knowledge, but potentially greater clearance in the liver might not be a good thing if they're just building up there and persisting.
It's a really good point, because I think the sort of naive view might just be anything that can accelerate those phase 1 and phase 2 reactions that lead to the degradation of the bigger molecule into a smaller particle is a good thing, but depending on how we can actually excrete the metabolized product is the question. And actually, are we making it more chemically active versus less? So it's a really good. I mean, like I think of sulforaphane, that chemical that you find in cruciferous vegetables, at improving the excretion of other environmental pollutants like benzenes and stuff. And so people are supplementing with things like sulforaphane tablets that you get from broccoli sprouts and stuff. That's perhaps more in that environmental pollutant field for like air pollutants, so things that we ingest as a result of industrial manufacturing. But whether that's transferable to this plastics conversation as a class of pollutants, I don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess like fundamentally, what is getting across into the blood?
Mm.
And then what is from that being accumulated in the liver? And then what are they breaking down to? Or are they breaking down? And then if so, what to? Like the fundamental links in the puzzle from like the gut to liver axis that you need to fill.
Dr. Stephanie, this has been brilliant.
Good.
I honestly, this has been such an education for me. I think it's been a super, super cool education for the audience as well. We've got some tips, some simple things you could do, some question marks, as always is the case with science. But yeah, thank you for your time. It's been great. Really, really, really cool.
You're so welcome. I'm so glad it was of interest. and yeah, thanks for listening to me waffle for a few hours.
We can listen to waffle all day. If you loved that episode, you will love the full library of podcasts from the Doctor's Kitchen Library. We talk about everything from inflammation, supplements, and food as medicine. Just like this episode right here. You can click it right now and check it out.